Welcome, beer theologians. This is Around the Word in Many Glasses. Today, we'll be drinking Guinness, and we'll be talking apologetics. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink, and let's get into it. First of all, our drink for today. It is, I'm fairly certain, the first non-German beer I've had on the program. I do, in fact, drink beers that aren't German, and Guinness is one of my favorites. It's great beer, isn't it? If you haven't had a Guinness, stop right now. Go get yourself one, and then come back and crack open that Guinness and join me as we go through apologetics. So, I do want to preface what we're talking about today and the beer kind of generally before we begin. So, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be talking apologetics here. I'll talk more about what apologetics is if you don't know before we get into that portion. But this really is coming about as a result of a conversation I had, a meeting with one of my confirmation teachers who, just for the sake of this video, we'll call, I don't know, Keith. And so Keith and I were sitting down to kind of take the pulse of the confirmation program about halfway through the year and see, what we could do to improve. And as often happens with conversations with really clever people, I end up with more work. But it's work that I enjoy, so it's quite all right. And although this is the first year where my new confirmation curriculum is finally finished. It's the concluding of the 2-year program. I'm going to write a new confirmation program for next year. Got a lot of really cool ideas with my conversation with some of my assistants in teaching that class. Again, in this meeting, it was the individual we will refer to as Keith. And as a result, a portion of that will be an apologetics section in this study, in this class, course rather. And it's the first time I've taught an apologetic, so I'm excited to get into it. In fact, I'm going to begin integrating the apologetics essentially immediately. Quite frankly, later this week, I'll be doing my first apologetics lesson with the kids. Today will be kind of my dry run with a little bit extra that we'll be covering today. But in conversation, Keith had mentioned, oh man, I really wish that I could take that class. I'd love to take an apologetics class. And when he said that, well, shortly after he said that, something kind of clicked, and I thought, well, if I do a YouTube channel, because I still wasn't sure if I was going to do this, then I could put the videos either really as practicing, rehearsing, getting ready for those apologetics lessons. I can put them on this channel, and we could watch them together and make them available to those who aren't in the confirmation class. Now, on to the drink. We have Guinness here today. And the reason we have Guinness is because, from what I understand, it is Keith's favorite beer. And it's one of my favorites as well, so I don't hesitate. So I think what we're going to do is that I will always have a Guinness whenever I do apologetics in honor of this individual, again, who we will call Keith, who, by the way, better be watching this. I'm doing this for you, Keith. So I do hope that you are watching and joining. And I will say that for all of my videos and everyone watching, there are no rules about that drink that you pour as you join with me in our exploration of drinks and the word. Unless you're Keith, and unless you're watching my apologetics video. In which case, if you do not have a Guinness right now, Keith, pause the video, go to the store, buy one, and then you are allowed to continue watching. But not until you have a Guinness. We're going to be in this together. Now, that being said, I will give you a pass. I was going to say that you have to get the can of Guinness with that nitrogen ball in the bottom, but you get a pass on this one. I still recommend this, but the reason I'm giving you a pass and you can have any Guinness that you want is I went to 5 different stores. I think it was 5 before I found this. And in fact, I talked to the second to last place I went was a mom and pop liquor store. And he asked if I had anything I was looking for. I said, in fact, I do. It's a can of Guinness. And he kind of shook his head and he said, we're out. And I said, you're not the first person who has been out. Again, I've been to grocery stores and liquor stores, and everyone is out of this. Is something going on? And he said, yeah, there is a shortage of Guinness. Not just the cans, although I think that's the most dramatic. He said that not only did he not have any cans, but he didn't even have the full lineup of the bottles on hand. So I was very lucky to find this can of Guinness and very pleased as well. I was about to give up on the beautiful can of Guinness. But I was able to find it at Publix. It's a great store. They're not sponsoring me, of course, but I do enjoy shopping there, and they were able to fulfill my quest for Guinness. And so, Keith, if you cannot find the can of Guinness because in addition to all the other evils that this pandemic has brought, it has brought on a Guinness shortage, then you're allowed to have any other kind of Guinness. But the Guinness is required, but it can be anything that they've made. Well, without further ado, let's open it. Now, if you've never opened a can of Guinness, or if you've never opened a can of a nitrogen beer, you're in for a special treat. That's what makes Guinness different than most beers. Most beers are carbonated, right? They have CO2. Guinness doesn't. It has nitrogen in it, which is why it kind of has a different mouthfeel to it, right? It's creamier. But what they've done to get the nitrogen in there is they have kind of a ping pong ball in the bottom of the can. In fact, you can hear it rattling around in there. You probably can't, but I certainly can. And when you open it, through the magic of science and engineering that I don't understand, the nitrogen is released, and then you pour it in very specific ways. They have instructions on the box. But one of the coolest things is when you do open the can, it makes an awesome noise. So I'm going to bring it nice and close so you guys can hear the beautiful sound of a can of Guinness opening. You're supposed to wait for it to settle, which it's not doing, it's foaming, and then pour. Now, of course, waiting for Guinness to settle is kind of their motto, right? It's not going to look good. If you pour it right, it's going to look like it's almost completely head. But that's just the nitrogen. That's just the way it works. Looks like I may have let it wait just a little bit too long there. But you're kind of seeing it, right? That famous billowing effect. I don't know if you can see it. I can see it. That the Guinness has. Actually been to the Guinness brewery, but we got lots of these apologetics classes, so I'll talk about that another day. But before we get into it, cheers. There's nothing quite like a Guinness, is there? It's absolutely excellent. I have this distinct feeling that I have a mustache. In addition to my mustache, I have 2 mustaches at the moment. So if you see me wiping my face a lot, that's because of the Guinness. But let's get into the apologetics aspect. And again, this is kind of my dry run for how I'm going to attempt to teach this to middle schoolers. Although we'll be doing some things at a little bit of a higher level, especially at the end. There's a section in here when we talk about falsifiability. I'm not even going to bring that up with the middle schoolers because it can be a little bit tricky to really understand what's going on with that. But I'm going to talk about it with you because, well, presumably you're either old enough to drink a Guinness or you're interested enough to be able to kind of work through some of these slightly more complicated philosophical concepts that we use in apologetics sometimes. So to kick off the apologetics series, I really want to start with, well, the foundation of faith, which is Jesus Christ himself. And this is going to be a very broad overview. This is in no way will this conversation be exhaustive on the apologetics that are in and around the person and the work, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ. So there's definitely way more to do here. In fact, I will recommend a book before the end of this, a book that I found very good. It's a high level book, but absolutely excellent. But we'll get to the book recommendation when we get there. So the first, well, actually, instead, let me go over all the different topics that I would like to cover here. And really, they're, for the most part, organized in a pattern of ascending dispute. Uh, more and more people will be disagreeing with us as we go further and further along. And there are three topics about Jesus that I'd like to cover, at least in some detail and some length here today. The first is the question of, was Jesus a real person? The second, who was Jesus, if he, again, was a real person? And then third, did Jesus really rise from the dead? That one is obviously the most controversial and, quite frankly, the most important. And that's kind of where the falsifiability comes in. So we'll talk about it there. And it's on that last point that I do have the book recommendation for you. So stick around. If I remember, I'll put a link to where you can find the book in the description. And if I don't remember and you're interested in finding it, leave a comment telling me that I need to update the description with the link. And I do know how to update descriptions. It's amazing. I'm already learning how to do this YouTube stuff, but let's get into it. So was Jesus a real person? One, almost everyone kind of agrees that Jesus existed and that Jesus was real. There are very few people out there, especially very few informed people out there, even atheists, right? I'm not even saying just informed Christians. I'm saying even people who disagree with everything else we're going to talk about today. There are very few people out there who don't think Jesus existed in any way. But let's lay a solid foundation, especially for those who may not realize that Jesus does exist and may not realize that just about everyone, again, no matter where you stand on Jesus, just about everyone does agree that he was at least a real person. Some common ground that we can all stand on. And what we're going to do here is we're going to actually rely on preponderance of evidence. Now, this is kind of a legal term, and I'm obviously not a lawyer, so I'll give you the best I can. And by the way, apologetics is not really my thing. I think it's great. I love reading apologetic works, but I'm definitely a stranger to this field of theology. It's not where I call home, if you will. So the preponderance of evidence is essentially enough evidence to prove a point. The legal system tends to use that term, right, that we're all familiar with, right, beyond the shadow of a doubt. And that's there. That can be one of the levels here, but we can also say that the measure of that preponderance of evidence is more likely than not, right? And for some of these things, that may be where we land on that, one thing is more likely than not to have happened. And that it just is what it is, right? It's all about apologetics in many ways is about having a conversation with others, but also it's a lot about reinforcing your own faith, your own belief that no, you aren't crazy. No, this is a reasonable thing to believe. It's reasonable to believe that Jesus was a real person. It's reasonable to believe that he was who he said he was. And quite frankly, it's reasonable to believe that he rose from the dead as well. Now, you can still have arguments about the implications of those beliefs and those statements, but apologetics is there just as much for the spiritual comfort of the individual on each side, or on the side really defending the faith, as it is for the person you're trying to win over, you're trying to convince. But we will use preponderance of evidence in particular well, really throughout this whole thing, right? None of these can be absolutely proven. If they could, then everyone would believe them, right? But we're going to use this kind of overwhelming levels of evidence to say it's more reasonable to agree with these statements than it is to disagree with these statements. And because few people argue against the fact that Jesus was a real person, what I want to do is I want to lay a little bit of a principle here. When you are doing apologetics with someone who is in disagreement with you, or even when you're doing it with yourself or within your own personal study, you have to consider your source. I see a lot of people go wrong when they're defending something. We'll say the existence of Jesus, and they pull out a Bible and say, "Oh, look, it says Jesus existed." Yes, yeah, that's okay, but logically speaking, that's an inside source. It has every reason to lie to you. Again, from a strictly, rigorous standpoint here, if you're going to do apologetics, especially with someone who does not accept that Scripture is the inspired and an inerrant Word of God, you can't use it as if it is the inspired and inerrant Word of God, which it is. Maybe that'll be another episode, is the defense of the inerrancy of Scripture. But the point being, we're going to look outside of Scripture for just about everything. We'll use some Scripture as we go through, but particularly with whether or not Jesus was real, we're going to look, in fact, to two historians primarily. Two historians that were not contemporaries with Jesus, but were close contemporaries. Neither of whom were Christians. Neither of these individuals had any faith in Christ, and so they have far less reason to lie or be deceptive about his existence. And in fact, one of these individuals is a marked enemy of the Christians, which again, consider the source, lends more credence to the reality of the situation. And in fact, let's start with that enemy. The historian at play here is a Roman historian by the name of Tacitus. You can look him up if you want more details. But in speaking about Nero, in his account of Nero, he records that Nero blames the burning of Rome and other issues as well on the Christians. And in his proclamations against the Christians, identifies their founder, in Latin Christus, or Christ in English. And he even says that this founder, Christus, was executed by Pilate. So we not only have just the acknowledgement of the existence of Christ fairly soon after, within living memory at least. People who were alive during the reign of Nero were alive when Jesus Christ was alive as well. But you also have details about specifically his death in this case. And again, that's found in Tacitus. The other historian, which is a far more famous one, I think, at least in religious circles, is a man by the name of Josephus. And he, not all over, but in multiple places in his Jewish Antiquities and the Jewish War, mentions and speaks on the existence of Christ. And he is Jewish. He's a Jewish historian. And so we have at least two, really more, near contemporary, not quite contemporary, historical authors, fairly well trusted authors, although they each had their own biases, of course, attesting to Christ, and neither of them are in groups. So neither of them are on the inside of Christianity. And so both of these lend credence to Christ. This is not to say anything about the mere existence of Christianity and the universal assent of especially the early Christians that Christ was a real person. And so because of all of this, just the way history has gone in the early couple of centuries, again, just about everyone, including non-believers, including atheists, including militant atheists, right? And what I mean by militant atheists is it's an in-group term for people who are antagonistic towards Christianity. So they're not a neutral party. And there are a lot of neutral atheists out there. I think the vast majority of atheists are neutral. But if you spend any amount of time, especially online, there are plenty of antagonistic or militant atheists, people who are out to get Christianity or to actively disprove it. And for the most part, especially the more well-informed individuals, are willing to agree Jesus clearly existed. And that's good. That's common ground that is near universal. It's as we continue in our discussion here, so we move on from here, that people begin to disagree. And the first of those disagreements, which has more than one answer, I'm not going to spend a ton of time. We're going to kind of use one big famous apologetic on, is the question of who is Jesus, or who was Jesus, right? So what I mean by this is, was he just a Jewish rabbi? Which, that's part of the story, right? Was he the son of God? Was he a moral teacher? Was he just some guy that got caught up in history? Was he a military leader? I don't know of anyone who thinks that Jesus was a military leader. What you tend to find is a few options. Really two, at least we can boil them down to two. Either Jesus was God, which is what he said that he was. That was his claim. Or Jesus is a moral teacher, right? Jesus wanted to teach people how to live a good life. It's actually very, very popular idea about Christ. And while you can be a moral teacher and God at the same time, what tends to happen is those who identify Christ as a moral teacher are, in addition, denying the divinity of Christ. Which, as far as Christianity is concerned, is kind of a deal breaker level distinction, right? If Jesus is not divine, then Christianity is kind of pointless, which lends itself to the falsifiability argument, but we'll make it in a stronger case at the end of this episode. But if you know what I'm talking about with falsifiability, or if you want to rewind to this point after the discussion, if Jesus isn't God, that's a falsifiable statement for Christianity. Again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, just keep it in the back of your mind, and we can come back to this portion of the video or think back on it once we kind of deal with falsifiability. The famous apologetic here is from C.S. Lewis. I think many people will be familiar with it. And C.S. Lewis says, well, there are actually three options. There are three potential options for who Jesus is. And of course, it's alliterative because C.S. Lewis is a literary genius. He's a mastermind, right? C.S. Lewis says Jesus is either a lunatic, a liar, or the Lord. Notice he leaves out moral teacher. And that falls, well, in the first two sections. So C.S. Lewis, and I believe it's in Mere Christianity. If you haven't read Mere Christianity, whether it's in there or not, it's absolutely brilliant. So one of the first major kind of meaty theological things I read, I absolutely loved it. Fell in love with C.S. Lewis when I read Mere Christianity and the Screwtape Letters were the first two that really got me hooked on Lewis. But he says in there, again, I'm pretty sure it's Mere Christianity, that Jesus, one of the options is that Jesus is a lunatic on the level of a man who thinks he is a boiled egg. Just wonderful, right? And what he means by this is one of the options for who you say Jesus is that he's completely crazy. He's a man who claims to be God. And sure, he had some moral teachings that people tend to like, but consider the message in a different shell, if you will, to perhaps have a callback there. If you met someone on the street who said that they were God and they had some moral philosophy to teach you, you wouldn't listen to them, would you? Right? You might call the police on this individual. Quite a few people who have founded cults have very similar sort of sort of hooks that they use to draw people in. And quite frankly, if you land on the Jesus is a lunatic, Christianity is a cult in that sense. I would say it's not, at least not in the modern sense. But one of your options in reading through Scripture and looking at what Jesus actually said about himself, so take him at his own words, is that he's completely crazy. That's a rational conclusion that you can draw. The second rational conclusion that you can draw is that he's an absolute liar. He's claiming to be God, after all. Really, this is both of these are predicated upon that claim, which is one of the central claims of who Jesus said that he was. It's the confession about him that he pushes forward, and it's really central to his ministry. And so he's claiming that he's God. One option is that he's crazy. He actually thinks he is God, and he's absolutely not. A second option is that he knows that he's not God. He's just lying, which is probably more the cult direction than the lunatic sort of direction. And he's being willfully deceptive. Now, again, remember, the moral teacher didn't fall in here. You're not going to take moral lessons from a lunatic. And if you're taking moral lessons from a willful liar, how good are those moral lessons going to be? Right? His whole shtick, if you will, is predicated on a lie, which just about everyone says is immoral, especially a lie of that caliber, to willfully deceive people about who he is. Not a good moral teacher, right? The third and final option that Lewis lays out is that Jesus is who he says he is. He is the Lord. He is God. And that's just who he claimed to be. And so that he's not crazy and he's not lying and he is actually God. And if you take Jesus at his word, these are the only three options. And again, to kind of go against the Jesus is merely a moral teacher argument, if Jesus is God, then what a demotion that is for us to claim, oh, God came down, but he just came down as a moral teacher, right? All those other things he said he was here to do, not interested in any of that. He's really just a moral teacher. Oh, yeah, he's God, but he's just a moral teacher. It's a bit crazy, right? If God actually did come down to us, who are we to say anything different about who he is than what he says? It's arrogant for us to think. And this probably isn't the whole argument, but this is, again, the most famous argument that I'm aware of. C.S. Lewis's lunatic, liar, or Lord. Who is Jesus? He's one of those three. You can't just pass him off as some other moral philosopher that is sometimes worth listening to and sometimes isn't. He either is God and therefore you should listen to him because he's God, or he's a liar or a lunatic, in which case you just completely ignore him. You don't need to listen to anything he has to say because he's either crazy or he's wicked. He's a liar. And so on to our final point of conversation here. Really the crux of the matter. The crux of the matter, absolutely. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? This is a big topic. Certainly more than I can do here. In fact, I'm just giving skim the surface overview of kind of some of the big ideas here. I'm going to give you what I think is the strongest case for the resurrection. Certainly not the only one, but what I personally think is the most persuasive. And then I would like to take really three of these alternative theories that are out there and demonstrate where they're weak, how they really can't stand up to the weight of the argument that they need to. If this is an interesting point of study for you, if you'd like to do more, if you'd like to go more in depth, again, that book that I'd like to recommend is Did the Resurrection Happen? It's not a book in the normal sense that someone sat down and wrote it. It's actually, I think, if I remember rightly, 3 debates between Habermas and Anthony Flew. I didn't give Habermas's first name because I don't remember it off the top of my head. Habermas is a Titan of Christian apologetics, and Flew is, or was, he has since passed away. Um, Flew was a titan of atheist apologetics. Interestingly enough, Flew did renounce his atheism to the massive chagrin of most atheists who were very mad at him for doing so. Now, he didn't, as far as we know, he did not accept faith in Christ, at least from what he wrote, what he left behind, what he wrote. He entered into some level of enlightened Gnosticism, or not Gnosticism, agnosticism. Um, Different, one letter, but they're different. Um, and so we don't know exactly what he died believing, but we know that he wasn't an atheist when he died. I think his conversation with Habermas, these two individuals were phenomenal friends. But the book is three of their debates on exactly this topic. Did the resurrection happen? And then an academic examination of the three debates by a Christian apologist, who, again, whose name I don't remember. It's on the cover of the book. A little word of warning if you do want to get the book. It is fairly dense and it's at a high level. Again, these are two very, very highly educated individuals. The debates are taking place, and I don't remember the college. It's been a year and a half since I read the book. It's more than that. Oh my gosh, it's almost been 2 years since I read it. But these debates are all taking place at the philosophy departments of high level colleges. And so they will introduce, or bring up rather, philosophical concepts and other theories and not explain them because they assume everyone there knows what they're talking about. So you may need to read the book with the internet open. Google will help you through that book a lot. Or you can talk to a pastor who may or may not be able to help. Again, it's not really a theology book, it's a philosophy book. And so if your pastor is into philosophy, then he should be able to help you through the book. But either way, reach out to your pastor, ask them questions. If they're anything like me, they love questions. Questions are just awesome. Um, but it's a great book. Again, did the resurrection happen? Lots of details. Again, not an exhaustive work, but a great place to start, and definitely a lot to chew on as you go through. So, what I think is the strongest external evidence of the resurrection can be found in the disciples. And granted, I will be drawing a little bit on the biblical description of the disciples, but quite frankly, you could drop those portions of the argument and it still remains fairly strong. So you have 11, 12 if you add in Matthias after the fact, but you have 11 individuals who, before the presumed resurrection, demonstrate that they are, to put it somewhat bluntly, cowards. They abandoned Christ during his arrest, with the exception of John. John does not abandon Christ. He's the only one who does remain. But some vehemently argue that no, they are not with Jesus because they're afraid of dying. For the most part, right? There's probably other elements at play there, but you have men who are terrified, men who are fairly low social standing as well. Most of them are fishermen. You have a zealot who is hated by a lot of people because they were essentially terrorists, at least in the modern sense, well, probably in the ancient sense as well. And you have at least one who is a tax collector who is worse than a terrorist. We'll have to talk about Roman tax collectors someday because they are way worse than the IRS. I promise. The Roman tax system was really awful, super corrupt, and totally brutal as well. So the people who were following Jesus were not well respected. So two characteristics going into this nexus point of the death and resurrection of Christ. All of whom were also considered criminals, but they were at least partially criminals. I don't ignore that sentence. They were terrified and they had low social standing. So, i.e., they would not have wide influence. And then, nearly overnight, certainly from a historical perspective, absolutely overnight, these cowardly, low standing individuals are able to become some of the bravest men in existence from external, well, biblically external evidence. Granted, it still is coming from the church. All but one of these men died, in all likelihood, really horrible deaths. We have at least 3 crucifixions, some beheadings, especially if you include Paul. Bartholomew was flayed alive, so they skinned him and then left him out in the sun until he just died. Thomas was impaled. Some were beaten to death, thrown off temples, and there were even assassination attempts on John, and he did go into exile. So you have this group of cowards who all they have to do to escape these brutal and horrible deaths is say, I lied. That's it. But they don't. Right? So these men who are so utterly and completely terrified of death, almost overnight, become massively confident in their preaching, but also are willing to face, in the most part, long, drawn out, brutal, horrific deaths. And all they have to do to stop it is say, I lied. Jesus didn't rise from the dead. That was it. That would have stopped the flaying of Bartholomew. It would have stopped each and every one of the crucifixions. Peter, of course, crucified upside down. That doesn't work, at least not in the normal sense. Peter didn't die on that upside down cross from asphyxiation. He probably died of thirst, hunger, exposure, or aneurysms in his brain from the blood running down. And for all of these individuals, all they had to do to stop it all and to be let go free is say, I lied. Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And not one of them did. Not one of them did. Additionally, these individuals who had fairly low social standing were able to enact a worldwide revolution. Not a political revolution, of course, but any corner of this world, nowadays especially, that you go to, you can find their influence, the influence of these 11 men. I don't know how else you account for that than that Jesus rose from the dead. Again, I think this is the strongest evidence for Christ's resurrection, outside of the Bible, of course, is the willingness of the disciples to die for their belief that Jesus not only is God, quite frankly, but also that Jesus rose from the dead. Again, put yourself in their situation. If you were lying, Jesus didn't rise from the dead and you knew it, would you be willing to be crucified for that? Or take any other lie, right? And you put one of those cult leaders we've kind of mentioned on a cross and say you can stay there, or you can stay there and stick with what you believe, or you can say you can deny your cult beliefs and you can come down. How many of them do you think would stay on the cross? I bet none of them would. The disciples did. Again, there are a number of other defenses, but I think this one is the strongest. And this is already a long video, so we're only going to do the one. What I do want to do is I want to attack 3 of the alternative theories. So these are the theories that say, no, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. This happened instead, right? The alternative histories that they lay out, right? And they say that the argument is that these are more likely that this happened than Jesus rose from the dead. The 3 theories that I would like to talk about and kind of hit at the knees, as it were, is what's called the swoon theory, the theft theory, and the hallucination theory. And we'll we'll start with we'll do them in that order. So the swoon theory is the theory that Jesus never died. Well, rather that Jesus didn't die on the cross. That he more or less passed out, or in an extreme sense, went into a coma um, on the cross, was put in the tomb, and then woke up 3 days later and kind of walked out of the tomb from there. This theory has some pretty massive problems. First of all, let's take the biblical account of the crucifixion, understanding that it pairs fairly well with what we understand of the Roman process of crucifixion would be. Jesus was flogged, first of all. Now, the flogging process, you can study more on this, but it was essentially a whipping with cat o' nine tails or other devices, ropes with either knots, just knots tied into it, knots tied with scraps of metal, or scraps, knots tied with scraps of bone in them. And prisoners who were executed, including Christ, were essentially flogged to within an inch of their life. In fact, it was not uncommon for the flogging to kill the individual, which in many ways may have been a mercy, because dying on the cross, as bad as flogging was, dying on the cross is just compounding upon that. But like I said, a number of individuals would die from the flogging that we know that Jesus did undergo. We have no reason to think that he didn't. It would have been fairly common for him to have been flogged there. And so that is an enormous amount of weakening going on there. In fact, if the Christian faith said that Jesus did die by flogging, then maybe the swoon theory would have more sway. It wouldn't be surprising that you would pass out from that, and maybe they would bury you, although there are some problems with that, which we'll get to. And who knows, maybe you could recover. Probably not. But that isn't all that happened to Jesus. From there, he was forced to carry his own cross. Again, common practice. Less likely, as it tends to be in a lot of movies and depictions, that Jesus is carrying the whole cross, right? The post and the lintel, if you will. In fact, if you've seen Passion of the Christ, they do actually, with the thieves, just show them tied to the crossbars. That would have been far more likely. The longer post would have probably already been at the site and would have been used more than once. But of course, in the movies, it's so ingrained in our mind that it's in all the movies. Whether or not Jesus was just carrying the crossbar of the whole cross, we don't actually know. Either way, more damage, right? And of course, the flogging isn't the first time that Jesus was injured, right? He had already had he has a crown of thorns at this point. He's already been beaten on the way to the cross. He's not in good shape. At which point, he gets to the place of execution. He gets to Golgotha, in this case, Mount Calvary, and he has then 3 nails, 3 or 4 nails, depending on a few things, right? Transfixing him upon the cross, right? One through each of the wrists, right? So the Roman reckoning of body parts, this is the hand, so roughly here, and they would put the nails through the wrist because you have bones there. To keep that can actually bear your weight. Whereas if you were to put a nail through the actual hand, the nail would rip out. So it would go through what we would call the wrist. There are a lot of arteries there, and in fact, the nail. I've lost the word, but the nail would serve as a plug, for lack of the correct term in my mind, that would keep the individual from bleeding out. But it was very presumably likely that if they did take the nail out, that even just the nail going through the wrist would kill the individual, or very well could, especially in both wrists, in addition to the blood loss from the flogging and the beating. And then, of course, the nail through the feet, either through both feet into a footrest, or perhaps one nail, the feet being put on the sides of the posts of the cross and the nails going through there. Either way, more trauma, more enormous potential for blood loss. At which point, the individuals were put up on the cross to die of asphyxiation, right? fluids filling the lungs, and I think there's issues with the heart that happen as well. There are lots of people who actually have medical backgrounds on YouTube and in other places. I can tell you what medically happens to someone who's crucified. And additionally, we know one of two things happen, right? You can believe the account we have that Jesus was impaled. He had a Roman soldier stab him in the heart with a spear. Or, for sake of argument, let's say that that didn't happen, and instead they broke his legs. Well, if they broke his legs, he can't walk out of the tomb, right? That ain't going to get fixed in 3 days. And so you have a man who's been flogged, nailed to a cross, in addition to all the other traumas. He's been asphyxiated until everyone there thinks that he is dead, and then he was impaled through the heart with a spear. That's a lot to recover from. That would be, I would imagine, immensely difficult for modern medicine to bring someone back from. Right? Pronounced dead on the cross, at least visually dead. I don't even know if we nowadays could bring someone back from that, especially with a puncture to the heart. Let alone just being wrapped up and thrown in a rock tomb and left there. Additionally, if Jesus did somehow recover from that, how was he able to remove the stone from the tomb? Or, presuming that there wasn't a stone there, we do know that there was a Roman guard. There's a very good reason to believe that there was. How did Jesus overpower them? Again, these are soldiers who haven't been all but killed a few days before, and then have received no medical treatment beyond that. So already there are a lot of holes, but there are a couple other things I want to talk about that fall here, but also will be helpful in other places. There's a sense that we have that ancient people were dumb. That's an incredibly arrogant view, first of all. And put a little bit of humility here, is probably further from the truth than we would like. There's a good chance that in a lot of ways, ancient people were far more intelligent than we are today. There are all sorts of ways that we can kind of deal with this, which I may or may not talk of another time. I bring this up, the one really standout example in my mind is that some people believe that the burning bush for Moses was really just a bush with red leaves. Moses knew the difference between a leaf and fire, right? He's not that stupid. Ancient people were not dumb. Yeah, sure, they didn't know physics like we do, right? They didn't have guns, they didn't know, certain things that we know, but that doesn't make them stupid. And in fact, there are a lot of things that the ancient people did that we still struggle to figure out even how they did it, let alone recreating what they've done. Ancient people in general are very, very smart. And so this idea that the Romans, or the Jewish people who buried him for that matter, couldn't figure out whether Jesus was dead or not is a little ridiculous. First of all, let's just look at the Romans. Well, before that, people back then probably knew a dead body better than we do today, right? Death is so sanitized and taken away from us that we really don't see it very often. I've only ever seen one person who, as they've died. I've only been with one individual. Now, that's not true of everyone, certainly. But that was not the case in the ancient world. Death was far closer. And so they were probably far more familiar with it than we are. And we would say, of course, we can tell if someone's dead on a cross in particular. And quite frankly, if there were experts on if a guy on a cross is dead, it would have been the executioners, right? These Roman soldiers have been crucifying a lot of people in the area around Jerusalem. They know what they are doing. The Romans were phenomenally good at crucifying people, and they knew when people were dead, particularly when they had died from crucifixion. Additionally, the idea that a Roman soldier with a spear would miss the heart of a stationary, not moving target to the satisfaction of a centurion who's watching over the process is also ridiculous. And I think we can all agree that if a spear actually went through Jesus' heart, regardless of everything else, he's done after 3 days. He's not coming back. So the swoon theory is probably the weakest of these theories. I don't actually know if anyone still thinks this. I know it was really popular for a while, but if you still believe in the swoon theory, if you know someone who believes in the swoon theory, please leave arguments in the description. I'd love to continue this conversation. I think that the swoon theory, quite frankly, of these is perhaps the most ridiculous theory, or the least credible, I should say. Be a little bit more generous of all the alternative theories that we have. By the way, I'm presenting these three theories because they're the three that I kind of know about. There might be others out there. Quite frankly, there might be more that they talk about in the Did the Resurrection Happen book. Again, if you know of these other theories, whether you agree with them or not, leave a comment down in the comment section and we'll talk about them. That'll be great. So the second is this idea that the disciples stole the body. Quite frankly, I think of the three, this one has the most potential. That being said, again, there were Roman soldiers guarding the tomb. They don't report the disciples assaulting, which they would presumably have reported because failing at their guard meant their executions. Not crucifixions, they were Roman citizens, but it still meant their execution. And so if they can give any sort of excuse for why Jesus' body went missing, they have every reason to, and we have absolutely no records. No one, not even Tacitus or Josephus, makes comments like, "Oh, those disciples stole the body," but they say they didn't. It just doesn't happen. Additionally, it seems unlikely that a group of ragtag fishermen, or maybe the zealot, and a tax collector, again, maybe the tax collector, considering their system, depending on where Matthew was in that hierarchy. But it seems unlikely that they'd be able to overpower and defeat a garrison of guards. Who knows? Maybe they had the element of surprise, but it still seems unlikely, especially because it's not mentioned. Additionally, and I think I've already covered the strongest argument against it, all these guys had to do, the guys who presumably stole the body, to stop their own horrid executions, was to say, yeah, I stole the body. I mean, quite frankly, they would have every reason to lie even about that, right, to stop these executions, and yet they don't. So I think the theft theory has some pretty significant problems. The last one is the hallucination theory. And this is the theory that Jesus never rose from the dead. No one stole his body. His body's still in the ground. But the disciples and everyone else who is an eyewitness to the resurrection is undergoing a mass hallucination. That they are not actually seeing Jesus. They're all hallucinating it. There are a couple of problems with this. First, there is no existing recorded instance of mass hallucination. It just doesn't happen. At least it's never happened in any place that we've ever witnessed it happening. Granted, this may be the time, but it'd be the only time, and that makes it somewhat weak. Additionally, it doesn't quite explain all the conversions that are taking place. The hallucination theory tends to say that people really, really wanted to see Jesus alive, rather, and then why are people converting? Because they don't want to see Jesus alive, but it seems that some of those early Christians converted because they saw Jesus. And then, of course, the last point, again, the ancient people aren't stupid. Immediately there were antagonistic bodies to the Christians, right? The Romans and the Jews did not want Christianity to be a thing. They wanted to expunge it as quickly as possible. Really easy way to do that. If Jesus' body is still in the tomb and everyone out there is hallucinating that Jesus is alive, all they need to do is open the tomb, which is in Jerusalem. A major city. And so you're going to say that, well, so one, They were probably clever enough to think of doing that. And two, they weren't lazy, right? We are far lazier than the ancient people. You think they're not going to walk 10 minutes or however long it took to go to and visit the site of the tomb, which was public. Everyone knew where Jesus was buried, and go look inside and say, oh, look, there's a dead guy right there. And he looks a lot like Jesus. So clearly these people are crazy. Doesn't happen. We would find records of that if it happened, but it doesn't. And quite frankly, Christianity wouldn't have gotten off the ground if that had happened, but it does. So I want to finish up here. This might be my longest video so far. It's exciting. Thank you, Keith. I want to finish off with this concept of falsifiability. And falsifiability is kind of a litmus test of, is your thought, is your belief rational? Or it's one way to say that your belief is not rational. And what this is, again, and I think, from what I understand, the pioneer of this theory is Anthony Flew, that guy that Habermas debated, and the falsifiability does get thrown in Flew's face when he says that there's no evidence. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So falsifiability, this theory states that if you believe something, if it's a rational belief, you can imagine, doesn't need to actually exist, but you need to be able to imagine evidence that if presented, will render your belief false. A classic secular example of where this comes up is with flat Earth theory, because there's a great Netflix documentary. It's called Under the Curve or something like that, where the scientists and philosophers talk about falsifiability specifically in reference to the flat Earth movement. You speak to some of these individuals who hold this flat Earth belief, and you ask them, what is the evidence that you need to believe that the Earth is round? And they say, oh, well, if we had a picture from space. Well, then they're shown a picture from space and say, oh, no, that, it's fake. So, okay, well, a gyroscope, and the movement of the gyroscope. And they see the movement in the gyroscope and they say, oh, no, something's got to be wrong there. Or they need this laser test that they've done recently. The laser test shows curvature. And they say, oh, no, something must be going wrong. The idea here is they are seeing the falsifiable evidence of their theory, but they're refusing to acknowledge it. Therefore, the flat Earth theory is unreasonable. Whereas a spherical Earther, globe Earth, I don't know what they're called, our falsifiability statement is easy. If you go up into space and you don't see a ball, the Earth isn't a ball, right? If you did go up into space and you saw a flat disk, then round Earth theory is out. And you got to get another set of beliefs to defend your position. Again, you as someone who believes in a round Earth can say this, understanding that particular evidence doesn't exist. And sure, you can pull other sorts of bits of evidence out that would falsify your theory. The idea being, if there's no way to prove what you believe is wrong, it's an irrational belief. And so, does Christianity pass the falsifiable test? Well, I've already mentioned one way that it does. If we can prove that Jesus isn't God, Christianity's gone. Right? If you can prove to me that Jesus is not God, I will no longer be a Christian. That's a falsifiable statement. The most famous one, the one that is in play here, is Paul's. If Christ is not risen, then our faith is in vain. Paul didn't even know he was writing a falsifiable in there, and yet he does, right? If you do find Jesus' body, I'm out, right? I'm done with this whole Christianity thing, because if Jesus is still in the grave, then there's no point. I'm done. Christianity has falsifiable statements. What comes up in the debates between Habermas and Flew is that Flew denies the resurrection and denies miracles in addition to that. And Habermas asks him, what evidence would prove you wrong? And he says, there isn't anything that would prove me wrong. And then Habermas says, well, isn't that violating the theory of falsifiability? To which everyone in the crowd kind of chuckles to themselves. And the moderator does actually insert himself here to inform those who might not know what's going on by saying this is flu arguing against flu. Essentially, flu, this guy who developed this theory of falsifiability, has an unfalsifiable belief, and he recognizes that, and he kind of says, "Yeah, my belief that the resurrection didn't happen is irrational." Um, and that doesn't mean everyone's is, but flu denies certain falsifiables for the denial of the resurrection. Again, so what you need to do for yourself, it's harder to do with others, but you can try, is ask yourself, and you can do this on more than just Christianity, right? I just provided the example of flat earth, right? You can do this for anything that you believe. Is there evidence that someone can show me that will lead me to conclude my belief was wrong? Right? The ability to change one's mind truly is amazing, right? And the ability to remain in a belief is also amazing, especially when you can defend that faith. Right? Again, that's what apologetics is all about. I think that's enough here. I think it's enough for our first lesson. We've gone for an hour, so clearly I'm not going to cover all of this with my confirmation students. But I hope you all enjoyed. Keith, I hope you enjoyed in particular. And don't worry, I'm going to ask if you've watched this. So if you have, you can avoid those questions by, shooting me a text or an email and let me know how the Guinness was. But until then, all you who wait on the Lord, raise a glass as we toast to his imminent return. Cheers.